have to tell this story. Not because I want to, but because I need to. What happened with my brother isn't just some business deal gone wrong. It was the demolition of a life and what I had to do to build something new. From the rubble still keeps me up at night. The smell of sawdust and varnish was the smell of my entire life. And that night, in the heart of our Chicago workshop, it hung heavy in the air, thick with the ghosts of 35 years of labor. The half-finished mahogany desk in the center of the room. A commission for a federal judge gleamed under the solitary work light. My son, my daughter, and my brother David were gathered around it, their faces lit with anticipation. This was supposed to be it, the celebration of my retirement at 59, the passing of a torch. But the first words out of my brother's mouth weren't a toast. They were an execution, the company's worthless Frank. He said, his voice smooth as the polished wood. Yet it splintered my world into a million pieces. Your buyout, your retirement, it's all gone. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is. Right now, it's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. It had always been Miller, Woodcraft. From the very beginning, when we were just two kids with a shared dream in our father's garage in Logan Square. I was the hands, David was the mouth. I could feel the soul in a piece of walnut, coaxing out its inner beauty with my chisels and planes. David could talk that beauty into a language people with money understood. He was 5 years younger, handsome, with a smile that could disarm a hostile board meeting, and a mind for numbers that I never possessed. I trusted him, implicitly. He was my brother, my partner. We built our name on my craftsmanship and his charisma. We weren't just a company. We were a story, a testament to family and the American dream. Our workshop, a sprawling old brick building near the Lincoln Park rail yards, was my sanctuary. I knew every knot in the floorboards, every scar on the workbench where a tool had slipped. It was where I taught my son Mark the basics of joinery, and where my daughter Sarah had done her homework as a little girl. The scent of cedar, her constant companion. Wed started with nothing. Borrowing a few thousand from our dad to buy a decent table saw and a lathe. The first decade was a blur of 80-hour weeks of sawdust in my coffee and varnish under my fingernails. David was out there knocking on doors, charming architects, courting designers. I was in the shop, bleeding for the work, making sure every piece that left with our name on it was perfect, and it worked. We became the go-to workshop for Chicago's elite law firms on Wacker Drive, penthouses overlooking Lake Michigan, old money families in Kenilworth. They all wanted a Miller original. My hands had crafted the furniture that furnished the lives of the city's most powerful people. I never cared much for the money itself, only for what it represented. Security, a legacy for my kids, and the freedom to continue my craft without compromise. David handled all of it. The invoices, the payroll, the investments, the legal paperwork, you just keep making beautiful things. Frank, he'd always say, clapping me on the shoulder, "Leave the ugly stuff to me." The ugly stuff was a mountain of paperwork he'd bring by every few months, contracts, tax forms, partnership agreements. I'd sign where he told me to sign. Why wouldn't I? He was the business genius who had turned my passion into an empire. My wife, Eleanor, had been more cautious before she passed. David's ambitious. Frank, she'd warned gently, just make sure you read what you're signing. I'd always brushed it off. It's David. It'd say, as if that explained everything. Their plan was simple. On my 60th birthday, I would retire. The company was valued at a conservative $8 million. My half, a cool $4 million, would be my nest egg. It'd buy a small place up in Wisconsin, build a little personal workshop, and spend my days making whatever I wanted. No deadlines, no clients. David would take over the company fully, and the Miller legacy would continue. The night of the celebration was 2 weeks before my birthday. David had called it a pre-retirement toast with the family. He wanted to do it in the shop, he said, where it all began. It felt poetic. Perfect. My kids were there beaming with pride. Mark, who worked alongside me as a master craftsman in his own right, and Sarah, a sharp, data-driven analyst for a tech firm downtown. They believed in the story as much as I did. They believed in their uncle that night. David stood before us, a grim, self-important expression on his face that I mistook for solemnity. He let his words hang in the air, a poisonous fog that choked the life out of the room. The market shifted, he'd said, his hands spread in a gesture of feigned helplessness. Overhead material costs, a few big clients, defaulted. It's been a perfect storm. He delivered the lines with the rehearsed sincerity of a televangelist. Mark started to protest. What are you talking about? We've never been busier. We have a 2-year waiting list. David just shook his head, a look of profound pity aimed directly at me. You were in your own world, Frank. You saw the wood, but you never saw the forest. The numbers don't lie. The assets are leveraged to the hilt. After we pay off the creditors, there's nothing left. We're bankrupt. Bankrupt. The word was alien. It felt like a language from a different planet. I'd dedicated 35 years of my life, poured every ounce of my soul and strength into this place for nothing. My buyout. I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. David's eyes, cold and dark, met mine. What buyout, Frank? You can't buy out a ghost. That was when Sarah, my quiet, observant daughter, spoke up, her voice cutting through the haze. You're lying, she said. Not as a question, but as a fact. I saw the quarterly reports you sent Dad. They were glowing. David's mask of sympathy finally slipped. A flicker of annoyance, then a cold, hard smile. Those were summaries, he said smoothly. Simplified for his benefit. The reality was far more complex. He turned his back on us. Then, facing the magnificent desk I had spent 300 hours creating, he ran a hand over the polished mahogany, a gesture of ownership that made my blood run cold. He was a stranger. This man who shared my parents, my childhood. My life's work was a complete and utter stranger. He had been living a different story all along, and I was just a character. He was writing out of the script. The air once filled with the promise of a well-earned rest now reeked of the cheapest kind of betrayal. My life's work wasn't just gone. It had been erased. The silence that followed his pronouncement was a physical weight. Mark's face was a mask of disbelief, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of a workbench. Sarah's eyes, sharp and analytical, were narrowed, boring into her uncle, dissecting his every word, every micro-expression. I just stood there, a statue carved from shock. My mind was a blizzard of white noise. Bankrupt, leveraged ghost. The words echoed but made no sense. Like trying to read a blueprint in the dark, David seemed to enjoy the tableau of our devastation. He picked up a small, intricately carved finial from my workbench, a piece I'd spent 2 days perfecting, and examined it with a detached air of a connoisseur. It's a shame, he sighed, placing it back down. You really do good work, Frank. A true artist, but art doesn't pay the bills. That was the line that finally broke the spell. The condescension, the feigned pity, it was more insulting than the theft itself. Get out, I heard myself say, the voice gravelly, unfamiliar. David raised an eyebrow. Excuse me, get out. The roar came from deep within my gut, a primal sound of a man watching his world burn. It shook the jars of screws on the shelves and made the sawdust motes dance in the light. Mark took a step toward him, his fist clenched, but I put a hand on his chest. Violence was what David expected, what he could use. It would make him the victim. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. David's lips curled into a smug little smirk. This is still my place of business, Frank. Technically more mine than yours now. He gestured around the shop at my tools. My designs tacked to the walls, the stacks of rare aging lumber I had personally sourced from all over the world. He was claiming my very soul. He turned to leave. Pausing at the door. I'll have my lawyers send over the dissolution paperwork, he said as casually as if he were ordering a pizza. It's for the best. A clean break, and then he was gone. The heavy steel door closing with a deafening thud that sealed the tomb on my life. The next few days were a waking nightmare. The lawyers' letters arrived a deluge of incomprehensible legalese that essentially confirmed David's story. Miller Woodcraft was a husk saddled with debt and owned for all intents and purposes by its creditors. My name was on everything. The loans, the lines of credit. David had taken out against the company's assets. I wasn't just losing my retirement. I was facing personal financial ruin. David had structured it perfectly. He, as the managing partner, was protected by the corporate veil, while I, the simple craftsman who signed whatever was put in front of him, was personally liable for a portion of the debt. It was diabolical. My kids rallied around me. Mark was furious, ready to break down David's door. Sarah was quiet, her mind working a storm, gathering behind her eyes. She sat at my kitchen table, a laptop open, surrounded by the few financial documents I'd kept over the years. It doesn't add up. Dad, she insisted, pointing to a spreadsheet on her screen. The revenue streams were solid. Your client list is gold. A business like this doesn't just evaporate. He moved the money he had to have. I was too broken to believe it. The shame was a physical illness, a constant nausea. I had failed my family. I had let Eleanor down. I had been a fool, a blind, trusting idiot who had spent his life focused on the grain of the wood, while my brother was busy building a coffin for my future. I spent a week packing up my personal tools from the shop, each one a memory. The hand plane my father gave me, the set of Japanese chisels I'd bought after landing our first major contract. My hands, usually so steady and sure, trembled as I wrapped them in oilcloth. The shop felt alien, haunted. David never showed his face. He sent a junior associate from his law firm, a kid in an ill-fitting suit, to watch me, to make sure I didn't take anything that belonged to the company. As I was clearing out the bottom drawer of my old roll-top desk, my fingers brushed against a stack of forgotten paperwork shoved in the back. It was a pile of old invoices from 5 years ago. I was about to toss the whole stack into the trash when a name caught my eye on one of the receipts: Apex Logistics Design. The invoice was for a massive shipment of rosewood, $100,000 worth. I frowned. I remembered that period distinctly. We had a huge commission for a law library, but we sourced the rosewood from a small family-owned mill in Brazil. I had a relationship with. I never ever used a third-party logistics company. I handled the sourcing of all our rare woods personally. It was my trademark, the core of our quality. My heart started to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat. I scanned the invoice. The address for Apex was a P.O. box in Wilmington, Delaware. The billing was routed through a subsidiary, ID never heard of. It was a ghost. $100,000 paid to a ghost. I shoved the invoice into my pocket, a cold dread mixing with a flicker of something else. A dark, dangerous curiosity. That evening I showed it to Sarah. Her eyes lit up, not with joy, but with the grim satisfaction of a hunter finding a track. "This is it," she whispered, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "This is the thread." For the next 48 hours she barely slept. Fueled by coffee and a daughter's righteous fury, she plunged into the digital rabbit hole. She cross-referenced public records, incorporation documents, and domain registrations. She used her knowledge of data forensics to uncover digital footprints David thought he'd erased, and slowly, painstakingly, the truth began to emerge from the shadows. Apex Logistics Design wasn't just a supplier. It was the linchpin of a massive deception. It was a shell corporation, owned by another shell corporation, which was in turn owned by a holding company registered in Delaware. The sole director of that holding company, David Miller. He had created a phantom business for years. He'd been using Apex to bill Miller Woodcraft for materials we never received and services that were never rendered. He would approve the payments himself, funneling our company's profits directly into his own pockets. But it was worse, so much worse. Sarah found the Apex corporate website. It was a sleek professional site showcasing a line of high-end office furniture. I looked at the images, and the nausea returned, with the force of a punch to the gut. They were my designs. Every curve, every joint, every unique detail. They were subtle knockoffs, simplified for mass production, but they were undeniably mine. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my work, my identity. He was building his own empire, using a cheaper bastardized version of my art, all while bleeding our shared company. Dry. The company he was bankrupting was simply the unwilling seed investor for the company that was making him rich. He had been planning it for years, meticulously, patiently, without a shred of conscience. As I stared at the screen at the images of my life's work twisted into a monument of his greed, the grief that had paralyzed me began to harden. It cooled and compressed, transforming from a fragile, sorrowful thing into something solid and heavy. It was the beginning of a cold, clear rage. He hadn't just closed a chapter of my life. He had handed me the motive for the next one. The rage was a furnace inside me, but it burned with a cold blue flame. For the first time in weeks, my mind felt clear, my hands steady. The image of David's smug face, the memory of his condescending tone played on a loop in my head. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the 35 years of trust he'd incinerated, the legacy he'd poisoned. It was about the name Miller that he had dragged through the mud while secretly building his own, on a foundation of lies. I had to see him. I needed to stand in front of him, armed with the truth, and watch his face when he knew that I knew. Sarah tried to talk me out of it. "Dad, don't," she pleaded. "He's a cornered animal. Let's take this to a lawyer, a real one, not the one he recommended." But I shook my head. A lawyer would see this as a financial dispute. This was a bloodletting. I found the address for his new condo online. It was in one of those gleaming glass towers that pierced the Chicago skyline, a place so high up you could probably look down on God. The doorman, draped in a uniform that likely cost more than my first car, tried to stop me, but I said David's name with a confidence I didn't feel, and he waved me through. The elevator ride was silent, a smooth, swift ascent into the heavens. When the doors opened onto his private foyer, David was standing there waiting. He wasn't surprised. He must have known I'd figure it out eventually. He was dressed in a tailored cashmere sweater and expensive slacks, looking relaxed, powerful Frank. He said, a note of amusement in his voice. To what do I owe the pleasure? His condo was a monument to his betrayal. It was a vast, sterile space of white marble and chrome, with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of Millennium Park and the lake beyond. And the furniture, my God, the furniture. It was all from the Apex line, my designs but cheaper. The soul was gone, the joints were not quite perfect, the finish lacked depth. They were ghosts of my work, and my brother was living in a haunted house he had built himself. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I pulled the crumpled Apex invoice from my pocket and threw it on the marble coffee table between us. Apex Logistics Design, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. Tell me about it. He didn't even flinch. He picked up the paper, glanced at it, and then let out a small, dismissive laugh. He walked over to a wet bar and poured himself a glass of what looks like very expensive scotch. You were never much for paperwork, were you? Frank, he said, his back to me, always so focused on the little details, you missed the big picture. He turned around, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Apex is the future. Miller. Miller was the past. It was a dinosaur too slow, too expensive, too artisanal. The market wants scale. It wants efficiency. I built a modern business. You were building museum pieces. The arrogance was breathtaking. He wasn't apologizing. He was taking a victory lap. You stole from me. I said the words, tasting like ash. You stole from our family. Stole. He chuckled again. A sound that grated on my nerves like a dull blade. I reallocated assets. I built a lifeboat while you were stubbornly going down with the ship. Everything I did was legal. Our partnership agreement, the one you signed 10 years ago, it gave me full operational and financial control. My lawyers made sure of that. You were an employee with equity, Frank. An employee who just got laid off. That's when I understood the true depth of his sociopathy. He had reframed the entire narrative in his head to make himself the hero, the savvy visionary held back by his sentimental, oafish brother. He saw my trust not as a gift but as a weakness to be exploited. He saw my passion not as the heart of our business but as a liability. Sarah was right. He had cornered himself, but he'd done it inside a fortress of legal armor. He was untouchable. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, I said, my last bit of bluster. He smiled a wide, predatory grin. Please do, he said. Send him my regards. I'm sure hell. Enjoy a nice chat with the team at Kirkland Ellis on Wacker Drive. They've been handling my affairs for years. They'll bury you in motions before you even get to discovery. You have no money, Frank. No standing. You have nothing. He took a sip of his scotch, his eyes gleaming with triumph. You're a carpenter, Frank. A damn good one. But that's all you'll ever be. Now, if you don't mind, I have a call with my investors. He gestured towards the door, a final dismissive flick of his wrist. I walked out of that building feeling smaller and more powerless than I ever had in my life. The cold Chicago wind whipping off the lake felt like a slap in the face. He was right. I had nothing. A mountain of debt, a name that was now synonymous with failure, and a skill that in his world was worthless. The next day I scraped together what little money I had and met with a lawyer. A decent guy who specialized in business fraud. He listened patiently to my story, looked over the documents Sarah had compiled, and then gave me the same grim prognosis David had. He's got you in an ironclad trap, the lawyer said, his face etched with sympathy. The contracts are ruthless. We can fight, but he's got a war chest and one of the best corporate law firms in the country. It will take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. You don't have, and frankly, your odds of winning are slim to none. I walked out of his office and just started walking. I walked for hours, aimlessly through the streets of the city I had helped build. I ended up without consciously deciding to, at Graceland Cemetery. I stood before Eleanor's grave, the grey granite cold under my fingertips. The little maple tree we'd planted beside it had grown strong and tall. "I'm sorry, Ellie," I whispered the words, getting caught in my throat. I messed up. I lost it all. I felt like a failure. A 59-year-old man with nothing to show for his life, but calloused hands and a fool's heart. I was about to give up, to let the anger and grief swallow me whole, to just fade away into a bitter old age. But then I looked down at my hands. These hands. They weren't the hands of a victim. They were the hands of a creator. They had taken rough, raw timber and turned it into things of beauty and permanence. They had built a life, a family, a reputation. David had stolen the company, the money, the legal framework, but he couldn't steal this. He couldn't take the skill, the knowledge, the soul. He called me a carpenter as an insult. But in that moment, standing in the quiet of the cemetery, I realized it was my greatest strength. His world was one of paper and lies. Mine was one of wood and truth. And I decided right then and there that I wasn't going to fight him in his world. I was going to drag him into mine and destroy him with the very thing he dismissed as worthless. The rage was still there, but now it had a purpose. It was no longer just a fire, it was a forge. The first step was the hardest, starting over. At 59, when most men are planning their final years of work, I was a novice again. I rented a small, dusty garage space in a gritty industrial park on the west side, a world away from the gleaming, organized workshop I had lost. The place smelled of stale oil and damp concrete, but with a few $100s worth of second-hand tools and a load of cherrywood bought on credit from an old, loyal supplier, it began to feel like a sanctuary. My son Mark was with me every step of the way. He'd quit Miller. Miller, the day after the betrayal, refusing to work for his uncle for another second. Well, build it back. Dad, he'd said, his voice, thick with a conviction I desperately needed. One board at a time, Sarah became my strategist. She set up a simple website and a YouTube channel. "People don't just buy your furniture, Dad," she explained, filming me as I hand-cut a dovetail joint. "They buy the story, they buy the craft. David is selling a product. You are going to sell an art form." The first video we posted was simple. It was just me in my new humble shop, talking about the properties of American black cherry. I spoke about how to read the grain, how to respect the wood, how to bring out its warmth. I didn't mention David or what happened. I just shared my passion. The video got a few hundred views, mostly from other woodworkers. But then we posted another showing the painstaking process of creating a complex inlay, and another on the forgotten art of French polishing. Slowly, something began to happen. The videos started getting shared in online woodworking forums, architectural blogs, and design communities. People were captivated by the quiet authority in my voice, the mesmerizing skill in my hands. I was the real deal, an old master, in an age of disposable flat-pack furniture. My subscriber count grew from hundreds to thousands, then tens of thousands. Comments poured in from all over the world. "This is true craftsmanship. They don't make men like this anymore." I could watch him work for hours. Without ever meaning to, I was building a new reputation. One based not on a corporate brand, but on my personal identity. I was Frank Miller, the artisan. Meanwhile, David was preparing to take Apex public. Sarah, who kept a close clandestine watch on his company's digital footprint, discovered the plan. He was going for a massive IPO, aiming to raise $100 million. The entire evaluation of Apex was built on a lie that it was the innovative, efficient successor to the legendary Miller brand. He was using our 35 years of goodwill as his primary marketing tool. His prospectus was filled with language about heritage tradition and a legacy of quality, all while he was mass-producing inferior knockoffs with cheap materials and underpaid labor in overseas factories. He needed my history to sell his fraudulent future. His arrogance was his Achilles heel. He was so confident in his legal fortress that he didn't see the rebellion I was fomenting right under his nose. The turning point came in the form of an email. It was from the personal assistant of a man named Julian Croft, a reclusive tech billionaire known for his impeccable taste and his collection of modern art. Croft was building a new state-of-the-art home in Lake Forest and was commissioning a few key legacy pieces from the world's best artisans. He had seen my YouTube videos. He wanted me to design and build a centerpiece desk for his new library. Sarah's research showed that David and Apex had been trying to land Croft as a client for over a year, seeing his endorsement as the final jewel in the crown for their IPO. They had been repeatedly and summarily rejected. This was more than a commission. It was a strategic masterstroke delivered to us by fate. I met with Croft at his downtown office. He was a quiet, intense man who listened more than he spoke. I told him my story. Not the emotional, bitter version, but the cold, hard facts of the betrayal. I laid out the evidence Sarah had compiled showing the siphoning of funds and the theft of my intellectual property. When I was finished, he was silent for a long time, looking out the window at the city below. The first piece of advice my father gave me, Croft said, finally turning back to me, was that a man's name is the only thing he truly owns. This man, your brother, has not only tried to steal your name, he has tried to erase it. He paused, a flicker of steel in his eyes. Build my desk, Mr. Miller. Make it the finest thing you have ever created, and let me know if there is anything else you require. I do not abide thieves. The plan began to form in my mind as clear and precise as a schematic. It wasn't enough to expose David. I had to do it in a way that would shatter the very foundation of his fraudulent empire. The annual Architectural Design Expo at McCormick Place was in 3 months. It was the largest and most prestigious industry event in the country. Sarah discovered that David was scheduled to be the keynote speaker. He was planning to use the platform to officially announce the Apex IPO to the world's most influential investors and designers. That would be my stage too. I told Croft my idea. It was audacious, theatrical, and incredibly risky. He didn't hesitate. He made a few calls and suddenly, a prime exhibition space directly opposite the main auditorium was made available to us to unveil the Croft Legacy desk. The trap was set. For the next 3 months, I worked like a man possessed. This desk would be my life's work, my closing argument. The exterior was a symphony of rare Macassar ebony and hand-forged brass fittings, a testament to the beauty of true craftsmanship. But its beauty was a Trojan horse inside, hidden within secret compartments and intricate mechanisms. I was building something else entirely. I wasn't just building a desk, I was building a weapon, loaded with the one thing my brother couldn't defend against the truth. As I worked late into the night, the garage filled with the familiar scent of sawdust, but now it smelled of something more. It smelled of justice. It smelled of revenge. The final weeks leading up to the expo were a blur of meticulous preparation. Every waking hour was consumed by the project. The desk was my confessional, my affidavit, my closing statement carved in wood and steel. On the surface, it was stunning, a masterpiece of form and function that represented the pinnacle of my 35 years of skill. But its soul was dark and complex. I engineered hidden drawers that slid open on silent magnetic locks. I designed panels that lifted to reveal hollow cavities. Into this secret architecture, I began to weave the evidence of David's crimes. I used a specialized printer to laminate copies of the fraudulent Apex invoices onto thin sheets of veneer, which I then inlaid into the undersides of the drawers. I embedded micro SD cards containing David's, incriminating emails, and bank records into hollowed-out brass fittings. I even created a false back panel for the desk's modesty board. On the outside, it was a beautiful piece of book-matched ebony. But when activated by a hidden switch, it would split open, revealing a cross-section of cheap crumbling particle board, the same material I discovered Apex used in their furniture, with a genuine broken Apex drawer joint mounted in the center like a sick parody of a museum exhibit. The desk was a beautiful lie that held an ugly truth. While I labored in the workshop, Sarah was my general marshalling our digital forces. She compiled every piece of evidence into an encrypted, unassailable digital dossier. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. A step-by-step chronicle of David's fraud, complete with timelines, flowcharts, and irrefutable proof of his money laundering. She packaged it for the one agency David couldn't control with his high-priced Chicago lawyers, the Securities and Exchange Commission. She found a contact, a notoriously tenacious investigator, in the SEC's New York office, someone with a reputation for taking down corporate titans. She sent the file anonymously timed to arrive on his desk exactly 48 hours before David's keynote speech. We weren't just seeking revenge, we were setting a precision-engineered legal snare. Julian Croft handled the logistics for the expo. He secured us a space that wasn't just opposite the main hall. It was directly in the path of the primary exit. No one would be able to leave David's speech without passing our exhibit. Croft's team also arranged for a small professional camera crew, ostensibly to film the unveiling of a significant artistic commission. In reality, they were there to make sure my story was broadcast far beyond the walls of McCormick Place. The night before the expo, the desk was finally finished. It stood in the center of my small workshop, glowing under the lights. Mark and I stood beside it, exhausted, but filled with a nervous electric energy. Hay's not going to know what hit him, Mark said, his voice a low whisper. I ran my hand over the flawless surface, feeling the cold, hard evidence hidden just millimeters beneath the perfect polish. Tomorrow, I said, my voice steady. My brother will give a speech, but I am going to tell the story. The morning of the expo was cool and overcast. As we transported the desk to McCormick Place in a specialized climate-controlled truck, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The anger that had fueled me for months had burned away, leaving behind only a diamond-hard sense of purpose. Our exhibition space was set up like a minimalist art gallery, stark white walls, dramatic lighting, and in the center the desk draped in a black velvet cloth. A simple placard read, "The Legacy Desk, commissioned by Julian Croft, crafted by Frank Miller." At 11 a.m., the chimes sounded, signaling the start of the keynote address. Through the doors of the auditorium, I could see David taking the stage to thunderous applause. He looked impeccable in a dark tailored suit, the very picture of success and innovation. He launched into his speech, his voice smooth and confident, painting a picture of Apex as the future of design, a company built on a heritage of excellence. As he spoke, a small invitation-only crowd gathered at my exhibit. Julian Croft, a few influential architectural critics, and several key journalists Sarah had strategically tipped off. My camera crew was in position, their live feed ready. At 11:15, as David began to build toward his grand IPO announcement, I gave Sarah the signal. She nodded, her eyes fixed on her laptop. A moment later, the massive projection screens on either side of David's stage, which were showing glowing images of Apex products, suddenly flickered. A new video feed appeared. It was a live shot from my exhibit. A tight close-up of my hands resting on the velvet cloth covering the desk. A low murmur rippled through the auditorium. David faltered for a second, confused, but the techs in the booth, following the updated schedule Croft's team had provided, let the feed run. I took a deep breath and pulled away the cloth. There was an audible gasp from my small audience. The desk was magnificent. My name is Frank Miller. I began, my voice amplified by a small, discreet microphone. My words now being broadcast to the thousands of people in the auditorium and live streamed online. For 35 years, I was the co-founder and master craftsman of Miller Woodcraft. My brother David Miller, who stands on that stage right now, was my partner. I saw David on the monitor, his face frozen, in a mask of confusion and dawning horror. I had his audience, now I had him. My brother speaks of heritage. I continued, my voice even and calm. I would like to show you what he has done with that heritage. And then piece by piece, I began to deconstruct his world. I opened the first secret drawer, revealing the laminated invoices. I explained the shell company Apex and how he funneled millions from our shared business. I pulled out the micro SD cards and held them up to the camera, detailing the contents of his own emails where he bragged about his deception. The crowd in the auditorium was now silent, all eyes fixated on the screens. David was frantically gesturing to the tech booth, but no one was listening to him. His carefully constructed image was cracking before their eyes. The final act was the most damning. My brother sells an idea of quality. I said, walking to the back of the desk, "Let me show you the reality." I pressed the hidden switch. With a soft click, the solid ebony back panel split apart, revealing the cheap, ugly truth of the particle board and the broken joint within. "This," I said, pointing to the shoddy craftsmanship, "is the soul of Apex. A beautiful lie on the outside, rotten on the inside." A wave of shock and disgust swept through the auditorium. The business reporters in my exhibit were scribbling furiously. Investors were staring at their phones, no doubt seeing the news alerts Sarah had just pushed live. The IPO was not just dead. It was a toxic asset. David stood on the stage speechless, his face pale, his empire of lies reduced to rubble in the space of 5 minutes. As a unified wave of people began to rise and walk out of the auditorium, 2 men and a woman in dark conservative suits entered from a side door. They moved with a calm, deliberate purpose, their badges identifying them as agents of the SEC. They walked right up to the stage, and the last thing I saw on the monitor before the feed was cut was their hands on my brother's arms, leading him away from the spotlight he so desperately craved. My revenge was complete. The aftermath was a quiet storm. David's arrest at the expo became the biggest story in the financial and design worlds for weeks. The tale of the truth desk, as the media dubbed it, was everywhere. My YouTube channel exploded and orders for my work flooded in from around the globe. I had to hire Mark on as a full partner and bring in a few trusted apprentices just to manage the waitlist. We moved out of the cramped garage and into a new, beautiful workshop, one that we owned outright debt-free. It was smaller than the old Miller place, but it was all ours, built on a foundation of honesty and hard work. Julian Croft's desk was delivered to his estate, and he paid me triple our agreed-upon price. For services rendered the note with the check, said David, facing an ironclad case from the SEC and multiple fraud lawsuits from his duped investors, was ruined. His high-priced lawyers, seeing there was no money left to pay them, abandoned him. He was forced to sell the condo, the cars, everything. His name, once a symbol of slick success in Chicago, was now a punchline. His entire life had been a performance, and when the curtain was finally torn away, there was nothing left backstage. His betrayal had been epic, a grand sweeping act of corporate villainy. My revenge had been quiet, precise, and absolute. I didn't scream or rage. I simply held up a mirror and forced him to look at what he had become. And I made sure the whole world was watching with him. I never saw him again after that day at the expo. The legal proceedings dragged on, but I stayed away, letting the system he tried to manipulate and master chew him up and spit him out. Months later, on a cool autumn afternoon, my son Mark walked into my office in the new shop. He looked down at the piece of tiger maple I was carefully sanding, a small, knowing smile on his face. "It's over," he said quietly. "Sarah just called David, took a plea deal. He lost everything. He'll do a few years in a minimum security place, but he's wiped out financially. Professionally, he's a ghost. I didn't stop my work. My hands moved in long, steady strokes, following the familiar patterns of the grain, the fine dust rising like smoke in the afternoon. Light, I felt the news land, but it didn't create a ripple. There was no joy, no triumphant surge, no satisfaction. There was only quiet. The furnace of my rage had long since gone cold. Its purpose served. All that was left was the work. He stole my money and my company. But the one thing he never understood is that my life's work was never in the books. It was always in my hands. The end.